Hi, everybody. Welcome to RHNA, and related topics. We're really glad you're here. This is the meeting that we promised that is focused a deep dive on the RHNA methodology and all things similar. So this is a webinar. It's not a meeting. It's similar, but it's a little different. The best place to ask your questions is that Q&A function. Ask those questions and we'll get through as many as we can. Okay, I'm going to get started. I guess actually before I do that, I'll just start with, I'm Josh Abrams with Baird and Driscoll. I help facilitate a group called 21 Elements. We'll go through all of this in a second, but we're sponsoring this meeting. We work with all the jurisdictions to help them on housing policy. And I'll just start with key takeaways. This webinar is going to get really complicated, and a couple of things just to keep in mind. Housing goals are up for the entire state. RHNA numbers are affected by a number of things, including good potential for growth, strong neighborhoods, for example, good schools, and access to jobs. Jurisdictions control some things, but there's some things that are out of everyone's control, out of the jurisdiction's control. And the last thing I think is a real important one is the system has quirks for sure, but we do need housing. So as you think about it, try and keep that in mind. Oh, and then the most important message, please don't shoot the messenger. I didn't write RHNA. I didn't write the law. I don't control it. I don't defend it. I am here to tell you what it is. We once actually did sponsor a bill, got a legislator to sponsor a bill to make a small amendment to RHNA to make it a little more sane, and that did not even get out of committee. So I'm with you guys. I have my preferences, which parts I like and which parts I don't. The agenda for today is we're going to talk a little about what is RHNA, make sure everyone's on the same page, talk about the process of how that goes, how the regional number, the number for the Bay Area region gets assigned, and how the city-specific numbers get assigned. I'm going to apologize in advance if this meeting is a little dry. Most meetings we do, there's lots of opportunity for public feedback and lots of opportunity for discussion. And this one is really just making sure everyone has a good, solid base of information. I promise you, throughout the housing element updates, there will be lots and lots of opportunities to lots and lots of opportunities to be involved, ask questions. We also, we turned off chat at our last meeting. You can chat us, but we had a troll sending racist, sexist messages. And then finally, I said this before, but use that Q&A function to send us questions. Okay, I was getting too excited. I started talking about introductions a moment ago. I'm Josh Abrams with Baird and Driscoll Community Planning. We've worked with all the cities in San Mateo County since 2008 to help them on housing policy. We're basically technical consultants that function as an extension of staff. All of our funding comes from jurisdictions. We have no advocacy agenda. Our goal is to help cities adopt the policies they want to adopt and to help the community's voice be heard. And whatever the voice is, whatever those policies or lack those policies are, we're just the conduits to make that happen. I'm just going to start a little with the challenge and why the state has gotten involved in housing to begin with. And I think it's an important context setting. Cities often permit lots of housing and retail development and not much housing. And there's a bunch of reasons for this. But one important reason is that office parks and retail pay better taxes than residential. Or in particular, retail and office don't contribute to schools and overcrowding, and they don't use services as much as homes do. It's kind of a tragedy of the common situation. What might be best for one individual jurisdiction is not necessarily best for the state. So between 2010 and 2019, San Mateo County added over 100,000 jobs in less than 10,000 homes. And that's caused housing prices to skyrocket. And rather than giving statistics, I'll just tell what I hear. And I get calls from people looking for housing. I'm not a developer. I don't have any preferential access to housing or affordable housing or any market rate housing. But I do work on housing policy and I give talks like this. So maybe that's where they got my name. And one call that sticks in my mind that I still think about to this day is a woman, and I'm going to call her Anna. She called me. She was in tears. Her husband had died, and she was desperate to try and find a place to live so she wouldn't be evicted. Her kids were in elementary school. Her job and her entire support network were in San Mateo County. She's dealing with this huge, immense loss. And there's nowhere in the county for her to live. And she's facing moving 50 miles away to find a place she could afford. So that's why we're here today, because the policies and choices we make affect real people. If we build enough housing, maybe the next Anna will have better options. Maybe she can rent instead of being an owner. Maybe she can find an ADU live in. Maybe she can move 10 miles instead of 50. But I I hope that's why I do this work, because I hope if together we make good policy, if together cities choose good policy, there'll be more options for everyone. So as we discuss RHNA, a dry and technical subject, if there ever were one, try to keep in mind why we're here and why it matters. Okay, from here it gets all business. Jobs, housing, that's actually to scale, give you a sense of the order of magnitude. Okay, start at the beginning. I think most likely everyone knows this is why you signed up, but we'll make sure. RHNA, it's pronounced RHNA, it's pronounced RHNA, is a target number of how much land has to be zoned to accommodate housing. There are targets for various income levels, not just one big target. And one important lesson is that cities do not need to build the housing. They just lay the groundwork. They have to have the proper zoning in place. They have to try and remove constraints, but ultimately it's developers who build housing. And housing element recognizes that and doesn't penalize cities if it doesn't get built, if the cities do their part. So you get your RHNA, you get your target number of how many homes you have to build, and you have to have enough land zoned for housing. It has to be more than your RHNA. That's the heart of what RHNA is, why it's good, why it's bad, whatever your opinion is, but that's what drives. You have to have enough land zoned for housing to accommodate that RHNA. And I know we already had one question about this, but ADUs, so granny flats, converted garages, and pipeline projects do count. They're a little different than how everything else counts. Everything else counts by looking at how much land you have zoned, and ADUs just count based on recent trends, and then per year, and then you figure for the 8-year planning period. And they count based on what affordability you think they're likely to be. So that's good news. And if you encourage ADUs now, you'll have an easier time meeting your RHNA in the year to come. RHNA might look like this. This is a sample city. So you see there's a very low income, moderate, above moderate. And in this example, the RHNA for the city is 240. Every city in the region, every town, every county has a RHNA, a target, and the RHNA that you can total them all up to get the regional number. So we got some questions about what counts. The state uses the US Census definition of a unit or a home. And in some ways that definition is a little generous because, for instance, we all know that some ADUs will be used as home offices, but they all get to count because they're all units. But in other ways, it's a little conservative because things like dorms don't count because they don't meet the US Census definition of a unit. For most communities, that's not a big deal because it's not a high percentage of housing. It is a frustrating part for some from communities. A wish list project of ours of 21 elements is actually to address that and find some better way of having those units count. And you'll see later in the presentation that the state does adjust the overall number for people who live in nursing homes or dorms. So overall on a statewide level, it plays out okay. It's just on a jurisdiction level sometimes if you're right next to Stanford and you have a disproportionately high number of dorms or nursing homes, your number, you might not benefit as much as others. And then I just put in, we'll send the PowerPoint afterwards. So I just thought I would put in the census definition of a home, but it's basically, you have to it's not a shared room. It has to be its own contained living space with where you're expected to eat by yourself. That's the definition, for better or for worse. So we got a bunch of questions before the meeting. We'll kind of answer some of them as we go, and we'll stop and take pauses to answer so people can ask more questions. One of the questions, does RHNA roll over from one cycle to the next? And the answer is generally no. Each cycle starts fresh if a city follows through on its commitments. If a city had made commitments and doesn't follow through, then some of the RHNA might roll over, but mostly it's a fresh accounting each 8 years. And what happens if we do not plan for our RHNA because we do not zone enough land? So the state has been cracking down each year. There's more and more consequences. Daisy, if you can drop into chat the brochure, a memo that the state just wrote about some of the consequences. We'll send all these chats, all these links afterwards as well. But you'll get a loss of access to funds is the first thing, then fines, and eventually, if cities still don't have enough, they're not zoning enough for their RHNA, judges can take away land use authority, so they'll not allow any building permits to be built. In some cases, they'll even not allow decks to be expanded and until the city becomes compliant. Daisy, you can switch it so the chats go to all participants and attendees to make sure everyone can see it.
That's what I have it on.
Oh, did someone said a message that they were having trouble seeing it? Participants can't see chats. Well, we'll work on that. Okay, good. So they should be there. You should be able to find the chats down there. Anyway, they're the links. We'll send them afterwards if you don't get them now. A related question, what happens if we do not meet our RHNA because developers do not build? This is a little different. As long as cities have a certified housing element and follow it, the only consequence is that it's easier for developers to build. There's not the severe consequences like if you don't plan for enough housing. I'll just remind everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. That's where we're going to be answering questions from in a few minutes when we pause for questions. I'm going to talk a little about the process. It starts with the state coming up with a target number for the region and the state laying the basic rules. Then the region divvies up the state number. And then cities and towns decide how tall the housing is, what it looks like, where it goes, the type of housing and the approval process. They decide a whole bunch of things within the framework of the state. I'm just gonna say, sometimes I'll call the state the Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD for short. Sometimes it's the legislature, but if we say HCD, understand that means the state. Here's the technical version of where I'm starting with the regional number. Here's the technical version of where the regional number comes from. We'll put in the chat there a couple memos about how this big picture number for the whole Bay Area, where that comes from. But don't worry, we'll be a little more user friendly. Here's the English version of it. The state does a population forecast. It looks at natural increase, so that's births minus deaths. I actually like to think of that as people getting their first apartment driving the new demand, but it's technically births minus deaths. Immigration minus emigration, people moving in minus people moving away. And then finally, you have to adjust that for household size. So there are more single person households. People are living longer, which is good. They're waiting to get married, but in any case, the average households is going down. So even if the population didn't increase, we would need more homes. And then that number is adjusted for a number of things like overcrowding, vacancy, the needs of different income levels. So looking at the other regions that came before us, that had their housing elements due before us, we knew that the number was going to go up. the Southern California region is the most similar in terms of overcrowding and the housing prices. So we are expecting a similar increase to them. And then I'm going to warn everyone, math on the next slide. If you have a low tolerance for math, feel free to turn your sound down for 30 seconds. We'll be through it and we'll go back to regular English. So this is where the region's number comes from. It starts with projecting what the population is going to be. So that's that 8 million number. And then it takes out the group quarters. Remember how I said dorms and stuff is accounted. So they actually do account for it there. And then so that leaves number of people in houses that, and then that gets cut down to households. So we started with people basically, and now we're at households. So there's a number of adjustments: vacancy adjustment, overcrowding adjustment, or a replacement, like homes burn down. They have it once every 200 years. Slowly they burn down. So it adjusts for that. That's a change how that's calculated, and that's a somewhat controversial one. Then they subtract how many units there already are, a small adjustment for people overpaying, and that's where we get to our number for the region, 441,176. So the target number for the Bay Area, how many homes we need to build over the 8 years. I don't think I said that clearly, but we're planning, when we talk about these numbers, we're planning for 8 years, from 2023 to 2031. So it's 441,000. When that number first came out, ABAG made a number of requests to have those change. Then the number was a little higher, to push that number down, and the state HCD accepted all ABAG's requested changes. Housing advocates requested changes to push that number higher. They had some concerns that the methodology was undercounting. The state did not accept any of those. So I think where we're at is, some people think it's too high, some people think it's too low. It is what it is. You can see our number is 234% higher than previous cycle. So I think based on Southern California, based on the math for the other regions, that's pretty much what we were thinking. And I think there's two ways to think of RHNA. One is as a floor, like is the minimum you need to do. When advocates talk about it, they talk about it not as a ceiling, not as the most you should be planning for, but they actually think, their numbers didn't get moved up. They think of it, this is the minimum, and ideally we should plan for more. But if cities meet their RHNA, then those consequences we talked about you don't get them. So I think the reality is there's a lot of things we can change, and then there's some things we can't change. I talked a little earlier about how cities can control where that housing goes or what it looks like. But at this point, the number for the region is fixed. There was a comment period. They use the same methodology as the other regions that came first. There was a comment period that opened and closed. State law at this point doesn't allow any changes for that big regional number. I was trying to think of a metaphor, and it's like when someone's rude to you, and once you get home, you think of all the comebacks you should have said, but it's just too late. So for the regional number, short of legislative action, it's just too late. And then one other thing I just kind of want to make the point is that number is the number that the state thinks we'll need. But in reality, if we want to build that many homes, we actually have to zone for or plan for more. So even if some people think, oh, well, we really only need 200,000 homes instead of 400,000 homes, it's actually a good policy to plan for more, because we know like some homeowners just won't want to sell or build, and sometimes the current use is too profitable and it can't redevelop, or the economics aren't right, or their environmental constraints. So it's actually good to have a buffer if that's the number of homes you actually want to build. Okay, let's pause for questions. My colleague Paul Penninger is going to moderate the Q&A. Are there any questions, Paul, about things we've covered so far?
So many questions, Josh, and some of them you've already answered. Some of them I've been typing answers to in the Q&A.
Paul, if you would please not type answers so everyone can hear us actually answer.
Okay. Well, yeah. Okay. So the first one, which I think you've already asked, is whether or not is accessory dwelling units or junior accessory dwelling units will count towards RHNA. And then there were a couple of related questions about whether or not tiny homes would count. And then also if there are other types of structures like co-housing that would count towards satisfying RHNA.
So yeah, ADUs count based on recent trends times per year trends times 8 years for the planning period. Junior ADUs also count. tiny homes, if it meets if it gets a building permit, and it probably would meet the definition of a unit, then it would count. If, a co-op is a little bit tricky. Sometimes how it ends up with something like a co-op is that might end up counting just as one unit because they share a kitchen. It kind of depends on if it meets that definition of a unit according to the US Census.
Okay, so in co-housing, it depends on whether or not there's the right kitchen and bathroom facilities.
That's right.
Okay, all right. So and we have quite a few questions, so I'll try to get through as many as I possibly can. One question was, for cities that are building huge office complexes, why aren't they required to provide the housing to support those ventures? The RHNA allocation should be weighted towards having cities that are benefiting from commercial growth to carry the cost, to carry the burden of housing.
That sounds like a policy question, and I'm going to stick to questions. I mean, that's why should I ask the legislature? I don't know. I mean, whether or not RHNA should be changed, that's beyond that. We could talk all night. We could talk into tomorrow. This meeting's going to be long enough. So that's a policy question. It's not, if you think that, it's great. I actually agree with you, but it's beyond our scope tonight.
Yeah. So a question I was just getting ready to answer in the chat, in the Q&A, but I won't type it in, is, will you share a timeline when the numbers will be finalized, et cetera?
Yeah, they're pretty close to being finalized. We'll talk more about that. We'll talk more about that when we talk about divvying up the regional number for each jurisdiction.
Okay. And then just a couple more, Josh?
Yeah.
Okay. If RHNA is concerned with how much land is zoned for housing, has the amount of municipal land zoned by city in San Mateo County for housing been published?
How much land is zoned for housing?
Right now, today.
That'll be, as cities write their housing elements, they'll look at how much land they have zoned for housing. So yeah, so that'll be part of the housing element process. I don't think, it's probably too early. They probably don't have it now in an easily accessible format, but that'll be part of the housing element process.
Okay. And then an easy one, Josh, do pipeline projects count?
Yes, pipeline projects count as long as this housing element starts in 2023. So as long as they're not finished before 2023, actually there's even a 6-month grace period so they can finish a little early. As long as they're under construction or planned, they count.
Great. We have a number of questions about things like affirmatively furthering fair housing and environmental issues and other things that kind of, I think, will veer into subsequent parts of the presentation.
Yeah, that sounds, yeah, let's hold those. We'll see if we cover them, and we can try and get to them.
I think we'll get to all the questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Were there any other, it's an 8-year planning period. I saw that was one.
So
was there any other
it's 2023 to 2031. One of the questions was, are the speakers going to introduce themselves, their background and credentials, and whether they are residents in Portola Valley or San Mateo County? I think you did that, Josh.
Yeah, sorry, I could say that. I'll be the main speaker tonight. I think my colleagues might jump in if they have any concerns or have anything to add. I've been working on housing elements for 13 or so years. I have been working in San Mateo County, supporting all the cities for that entire time, actually, though I do live on the East Bay. Okay.
Josh, there's a question about appeals, which I think that also that's something that we're going to cover in a bit, and it's a pretty lengthy question and a good one. So we probably
we'll get to appeals. I think we're just on the big regional number right now.
Just the big regional number. So another one that's pretty easy is the Central Valley part of the Bay Area?
Nope, it's Santa Clara, San Mateo, Alameda, Contra Costa, Marin, just the inner Bay Area. So it goes as far as Solano, Sonoma, Napa.
How is the climate crisis factored into the allocation?
The big regional number is calculated like we talked about. So
go ahead.
In that perhaps it might affect whether or not people are moving here or not moving here. It's affected into that big regional number, and we'll talk about how it plays into the local number when we get to that section.
Okay, and then particularly, like, there's interest in understanding how fire risk and sea level rise and water shortages and environmental constraints affect site analysis.
So that's all each jurisdiction question. Let's,
Oh.
should we head there? I
Let's do
think
it.
that's,
There's
okay.
so many more, but we'll keep going.
Okay.
Oh, no, this is a basic one. What is a pipeline project?
Good
Follow up to the
question.
follow-up.
Not actually, sorry, if we say jargon, call us on it. A planned project, a project that's currently under construction, a project that's known about, it's in the housing pipeline, in the construction pipeline, has nothing to do with Keystone Oil or anything like that. So.
Great. And then Josh, I promise this is the very last one before you can go on. Do leftover RHNA units not constructed from the previous cycle get added to the next RHNA cycle?
If a city did everything it said it would do to remove constraints, to rezone land, and property owners didn't build, then the city doesn't have any, then that's what happens. The owner didn't build. In that it'll contribute to a bigger unmet demand for the region, then yeah, the bigger regional number, the number in the region might be higher based on not producing enough housing in the past. But cities aren't penalized as long as they do what they are required to do.
Great. All right.
Let's keep going. The regional process. So that 400,000 number, the state gives that to the Association of Bay Area Governments, or ABAG, for the Bay Area. And then the ABAG has to decide how to divvy that up. We're gonna put in the chat a link for a good summary of that document, but we'll go over it. Let's start a little with the process of how ABAG decides. There was a housing methodology committee. We'll talk more about all of these that made recommendations. Then the ABAG board, which is elected officials from representative cities, adopts a draft methodology. The state looks at that draft methodology and approves it, or finds that it's consistent or not consistent with state law. ABAG then adopts the final methodology. That's where we're almost at now. The state found that the method was consistent with state law. So that means the ABAG's board will adopt it, because they're only allowed to make changes based on comments from the state, and the state said it complies with state law. So ABAG will adopt the final methodology. So the numbers we talk about are pretty close to final. The only way that they're going to change are through the appeals period. And we'll talk about that, but they're not final. They won't be final till winter 2021, but you can be pretty sure that your number is pretty close. You'll see appeals tend not to change the numbers very much. Okay, the Housing Methodology Committee. Other regions just had their staff or their decision makers internally come up with what the methodology would be. ABAG, like they have in past cycles, they actually formed this methodology committee. It was 9 electeds, 1 from each county, 12 jurisdiction housing or planning staff, and then 16 regional stakeholders representing equity, open space, health, public transit, and then the state government sat in there, didn't vote, but as a advisor. So this group met a dozen or more times. I should say that I was actually on this committee for a while until I started a project, and ABAG decided that I couldn't work on the project and be on the methodology committee, so I stepped away. But this committee came up with the draft recommendations, which is pretty close to what the board ended up adopting. So the first step, the methodology committee came up with the recommendations. I should say the methodology committee in ABAG doesn't have carte blanche, total freedom to do whatever they want. There is statutory guidelines that they have to follow. So this is what the state HCD was evaluating them on. And each of these has different specific matrix criteria, metrics, I guess is what I wanted to say, underneath to make sure that they're doing it. Affirmatively furthering fair housing is the newest of the ones. Those guidelines aren't well developed yet, but they should be out soon. Though we've been saying they should be out soon for months. That means is making sure low income and communities of color aren't disproportionately affected by decisions. So making sure they're not overly impacted, disproportionately impacted, and also making sure that they're involved, making sure you're looking at who's participating in conversations and that it's representative of the community as a whole. So the appeals process, I know there's a lot of interest in the appeals process. A few takeaways. It opens this summer, so there's nothing you can actually do right now. The ABAG hasn't even come out with their guidelines. There's really limited criteria about what you can appeal on. It's statutory, so ABAG has some limited discretion in it. And then in the Southern California region, which is ahead of us, and in previous cycles, there's been very limited success in appeals. So in Southern California, there were 52 appeals this cycle. 2 were partially upheld. 1 was just a straight up mapping error, like they had the wrong coordinates for the jurisdiction boundary. The other was an equally technical issue. All of the ones that were appealing on broader grounds, from COVID to we don't have space, none of those were upheld. This is the statutory language. So again, there's no discretion. ABAG has to, if it makes an appeal, it has to follow one of these. But it's a little confusing. I'll put it in English as best I can. The first one is the methodology not follow the rules. That's actually a really pretty hard sell, because ABAG determined that it followed the rules. The state determined that it followed the rules. So a city could argue that the methodology didn't advance those criteria that we looked at a minute ago, but it's unlikely that that's going to be too sympathetic of an argument. The second one is a little weird. Oftentimes, regions will let, if the methodology was not implemented correctly, like that mapping error example I gave, they'll let the number be adjusted for that. But there's actually, it's not clear from the statute if you can do that, but often it seems reasonable that happens. So that often happens. Now, I'm gonna say that if every little tiny mapping error, they're not going to look for. I really would be very surprised if they accepted appeals about that. But major mapping errors, major other problems where the methodology wasn't implemented correctly, that's something that sometimes has been is a ground for appeal. And then the third one is significant unforeseen events. I'll just add a comment that COVID is not an unforeseen event. We are in the middle of the pandemic when the board adopted the methodology. This is a letter. The state actually doesn't get to weigh in on appeals, but they sent a letter to Southern California sharing their thoughts. Daisy will share a link to their letter, but it'll show you how the state's totally behind the region in being very skeptical about appeals. But they said several jurisdictions cite the lack of land suitable for development as a basis for the appeal. However, even in the communities that view themselves as built out, must plan for housing through means such as rezoning commercial areas as mixed use areas and upzoning non-vacant land. Pretty much what you see in their letter is like every reason that most people would come up with like, but there's fire, but there's this, but there's that. They say it's not a grounds for appeal. Okay, we're going to pause again for questions, not about the specific numbers that each jurisdiction has. We'll get to those, I promise, but about the process, the things I talked about now.
Josh, and this was the very first question, and we're getting to it now. I think it's the right place in the flow, but it's about how cities can show that they're on progress to meet their RHNA. Does it require specific zoning for specific areas for mixed income or below market rate projects? And then in communities that don't have, related to this, that haven't built enough housing, or where housing hasn't been built at the level to satisfy the RHNA, how can low income housing be built?
So the way you show that you're going to meet your RHNA, so you can start by showing how many ADUs you built and assume that you'll have a similar trend. And we're actually working on an affordability report to help put those ADUs in different affordability categories. So that's the first piece. Then you can look at pipeline projects under construction or that you know about. You can talk about those will count. And then you go through site by site to look at what land is available for housing. Now, again, going back to this metaphor of cities set the table, but they don't actually build the housing. If you talk to nonprofit developers, what they say is they need enough density. So they need maybe for 20 or 30 units per acre, and they need enough sites to be able to build affordable housing. So in order to be able to consider it ripe to build affordable housing and account it as in those affordable categories, city's responsibility is to zone at 20 or 30 units per acre, depending on the size of the city. And also potentially there might be some limits on making sure the sites can have enough homes on that process, on that actual site to make it feasible for low income developers. There's a huge, the methodology just goes on and on and on from there, and we only have till 7. So
Josh, related to that, there was a question about do cities receive credit for planning for mixed use projects that include both residential and commercial uses?
yeah, so I mean, you would have to make some reasonable assumption. Like if historically you had a mixed use zone that allowed residential and commercial, and half of those projects were residential and half were commercial, when you're saying what's likely to develop in the future, you should base it on something like that or market economics. So if you have a mixed use zone, it's probably unrealistic to assume it'll be 100% residential, but you can, whatever is a reasonable assumption about what's going to be residential, you can count those units.
Great.
I had to say things get really complicated. Everything we say is 99% true, but there are some exceptions.
This is a question about what happens if the city has built something on every square foot of land. Do they have to take down non-residential structures to build a residential structure?
Cities never actually have to do dismantling or construction projects, but if a city is built out, they would be expected to put in place zoning that offers incentives, or at least at the very least allows property owners to build residential. So maybe it's the failed strip mall that would go first and turn to residential. Maybe it's a old mall that's closed, and if you put the right zoning in place or you work with the developer, you would be able to get housing there. So you have to, even if you're built out, you can't get out of your RHNA.
So this is a question about household size, which is the RHNA assumes a certain household size, but does not require cities to plan for any particular household size. How can cities ensure that their plan actually meets the needs by household size of the actual households in the community?
Yep. And then Paul, this is going to be the last one I'm going to do just so we can make sure we get through everything. Sure. So there's a lot of things that the state tells you have to do. And then there's a lot that cities should just use the housing element as their opportunity to plan for their own housing needs. And this is when the state it makes you think a little about large households, but mostly that's a great opportunity for cities to encourage. I am somewhat worried about not enough family housing in San Mateo County, that a lot of the new apartments being built are smaller units. So that's a great opportunity. That's a question for the policies and programs section, which is a whole separate other discussion. But we were just having some chat amongst city staff about what they can do to encourage more family size housing, and bring that up to your city staff. Tell them that's important to you, and hopefully it'll turn into a policy and program. Okay, I'm going to keep going. I want to at least get through all our slides. If people want to stay late and have me answer more questions, I'll do that, but I at least want to get through everything we plan to present. So we're going to talk about the RHNA methodology. This is where we split up the big number from the state all the way, and each city gets its own target, that 441,000 number. The starting point for how to split it up is something called Plan Bay Area, which we'll talk about more, which could be this whole other talk. Everything is so complicated. I'm so sorry. I wish I could make it simpler. And then it's adjusted based on jobs and high opportunity areas. We'll go over each of these. Don't worry. Plan Bay Area, I'm going to take a little detour, talk about Plan Bay Area. It's a rated planning effort that, again, it's a very big topic. Is also very, very hard to understand everything that goes into Plan Bay Area. What's important for Plan Bay Area is it's a long-range 30-year plan that looks at how the Bay Area might be in the future. So these are a whole bunch of ideas, strategies, how they're going to adapt to sea level. There's how the transportation is going to change. And based in some on city zoning, some on what land uses are there. Plan Bay Area makes assumptions about where growth might happen. Doesn't force cities to grow by any means, but this is going to be really important because because the RHNA is going to be based on how cities are, Plan Bay Area thinks cities are likely to change. So cities that had the best redevelopment areas, malls, old office parks that weren't doing well, sites that were just likely to turn into housing or could easily turn into housing, they had the biggest numbers for Plan Bay Area. So the upshot, kind of the big picture of Plan Bay Area is we don't want to assume that San Jose and Emeryville's 1 square mile, that's why I chose it, will have the same amount of growth, right? That wouldn't work because San Jose is much bigger. So Plan Bay Area is a way to compensate for different starting places. So everything is kind of scaled based on what Plan Bay Area thinks your population will be in a number of years. I think Daisy can put in, which I think she already did, some more information about how to understand Plan Bay Area. I think it's a little frustrating for some people because Plan Bay Area is really hard to understand what exactly the assumptions are. It's easier to understand on the region, but anyway, that's the starting place. And then that starting place is adjusted based on some criteria. And this is a little bit different for lower income, planning for lower income or higher income. 70%, it's adjusted based on, you see all these add up to 100%. So 70% of the adjustment is access to high opportunity areas, 15, and then 30% is about job proximity, 15% auto and 15% transit. And then for market price housing, it's less emphasis on the high opportunity areas. I'll tell you all the details of these in 1 minute, and more on job proximity auto. Okay, don't worry if you didn't catch that. We'll come back to it. It'll make more sense. So the job proximity auto, this is a little more detail. You see the share of the region's total jobs that can be assessed from a jurisdiction by a 30-minute auto commute during the morning peak hour. So if a lot of jobs are near your jurisdiction, then you'll have a high RHNA. Also, if a lot of your jobs are near a 45-minute transit commute, then you'll have a high RHNA. So that starting point is tweaked up or tweaked down based on those two factors. The high opportunity areas is another concept that's a little complicated, but it's a way of looking at healthy communities. So it looks at a whole bunch of different things: education, exposure to environmental toxins, employment rates, jobs, home values, racial segregation, poverty. It looks at all of these things. Daisy's adding a link to there's a 22-page methodology about the maps that you see on the screen. But if you have a lot of good schools, not a lot of environmental toxins, things like that, then you'll get your RHNA will be pushed higher. Otherwise, it'll be pushed a little lower. So I'm just going to share this slide again, because I think once you know what these are, it makes a little more sense. So your RHNA is pushed a little higher if you have high opportunity areas and lower if you don't. And then a little higher if you have good job proximity, and lower if you don't. I'm going to pause for just a moment there. Okay, then there was one other thing that happened, what they called an equity adjustment, which I think sounds great in theory. I think some of us had concerns about how it actually rolled out. Some cities, a group of housing methodology committee members, that committee I talked about, were concerned that some wealthy cities weren't getting high enough adjustment. So after all those calculations, some cities' numbers were moved up and consequently others moved down, that based on to ensure that the high income areas really had at least their share of low income housing RHNA for the region. I think where it got a little weird is Daly City and Half Moon Bay are not particularly high income areas for San Mateo County, but they got caught up in the equity adjustment, as well as Atherton, Portola Valley, and Hillsborough. Most cities it didn't affect at all, or they went slightly down. Okay, so the RHNA, what is the RHNA number? What everyone probably wanted to know the whole time. It's this is the RHNA number for all the cities. Might change based on appeals, might change slightly, but probably this is about what they are. And then I think
Josh, can I ask just a quick question related to this?
Yeah.
There's been a couple of questions about what this means in terms of number of people. This is number of occupied housing units.
Yeah, I think it's about 2.2 people per per home. We would have to look up the average household size in San Mateo County.
Yeah, that's about right. Okay.
That's a good question. Okay, so and each of these has their own breakdown by income category. That report that we shared earlier, and I forget if we have a new link here, but it'll show the actual income breakdown too. Okay, a couple of questions we got. Why is my RHNA so high? Well, one is everyone's RHNA is high. There's just a lot of need for housing. So that's, I think the average RHNA from last cycle went up 230%. So everyone's is high. They're good. The other is there's good growth areas according to Plan Bay Area that would push your RHNA up. There's a lot of opportunity areas, good schools, low pollution, or the jurisdiction is near jobs. So San Mateo gets caught up a little in the San Mateo is a little job heavy and gets caught up in a little in the Santa Clara jobs. So that pushes the number high for some jurisdictions and down for others. And then what does RHNA consider? We got a bunch of questions. Does it consider infrastructure? So yes, Plan Bay Area looks at infrastructure constraints. I mean, in some ways it imagines infrastructure will change over the 30 years, but in others, it looks at infrastructure constraints. Greenhouse gases, yes, both Plan Bay Area and the methodology, because the methodology's emphasis on transit and being near jobs, take into account greenhouse gases. Plan Bay Area very explicitly had clear greenhouse gas targets. Wildfire risk, yes, the Plan Bay Area takes into account wildfire risk. Limited transit, yes, Plan Bay Area and the methodology both take into account limited transit. Okay, RHNA jobs. I think one thing that's helpful is just to look at San Mateo's population and RHNA compared to their share of the population. So if you look, you see the RHNA, San Mateo County is about 11% of the growth target or the RHNA, and last cycle it was 9%, so that's a little bit higher. It has about 10% of the Bay Area households and about 10% of the Bay Area jobs. It's actually a little more than 10% of the Bay Area jobs. This number's a little old, but you can see, so maybe it's a little higher. Maybe that's because of the high opportunity areas. Maybe that's because of being near Silicon Valley jobs or San Francisco jobs, but it's not, on the very top line analysis of how is it faring compared to other counties, it's about what you'd expect. Okay, I think this is the best report. We shared it earlier. We'll send it out. This is a report that ABAG came out with that goes over the methodology. And they give you a formula on page 13. And then the numbers for inputting into the formula start on page 20. But this goes over exactly like which of those criteria pulled your city up, which pulled it down, what was the starting space. It's not totally for the faint of heart. Like the math is a little hard to figure out, but if you read it slowly and carefully and several times, it actually does give you the answer to exactly how your jurisdiction ended up where it ended up. Oh, and then we should have had a question slide in there. So let's do questions.
Great. So Josh, there's a whole bunch of questions about how Plan Bay Area and then related to Plan Bay Area, the RHNA takes into account sea level rise and then also wildfire risk. So if there's a wildfire in your area, does RHNA consider that? If cities are facing sea level rise and loss of land related to sea level rise, does RHNA take into account those factors?
Yeah, so I should say I'm not a Plan Bay Area expert, but Plan Bay Area definitely takes into account wildfire. Otherwise, an infrastructure. Otherwise, like Woodside would be expected to grow much more than it's expected to grow. But the high wildfire pushed those numbers down in Plan Bay Area. Consequently, the RHNA was pushed down. Also, the Plan Bay Area made assumptions about where new growth would happen based on sea level rise. So that is taken into account.
Great. And then there's another couple of questions that really have to do with infrastructure and how does Plan Bay Area coordinate water and transportation development with housing growth? And then also, does it take into account infrastructure costs and offer any help to cities that need help with infrastructure costs?
Well, Plan Bay Area is a visioning exercise, so it doesn't actually require anything to be built, any roads to be built, but it does. There's a section, I talked mostly about the growth projections because that affects with housing, but there's an environmental and a transportation and economic, and there's a whole bunch of different visioning activities in there, and a huge number of infrastructure projects, a bunch of proposals about how to fund those infrastructure projects. But being in a plan, this is the world of planners, being in a plan does not make it so. So all of those ideas would have to be approved and funded and enacted, but it does really try, it's a very iterative process. They definitely tried to incorporate, like, well, if we expand this road, if we do the Dumbarton Bridge as for transit, then how would growth respond? Then how would greenhouse gases respond? So it does look into that. I mean, you can Plan Bay Areas, there's videos, there's websites, there's tons of material. We can again, it could be we could devote the whole hour and a half to Plan Bay Area.
Great. There's also a whole bunch of questions related to the appeals process. Do you want to hold off on those until the very end of the webinar, or do you want to?
We can talk appeals. We can talk appeals.
Okay. So one question is about what the typical range in the last cycle. Did appeals normally result in changes to RHNA figures? And if so, what was the range? And then also related to that, well, why don't we start there?
I don't have the last. Yeah, the last cycle, I'd have to pull up. I think it was about 10% of appeals from the last cycle were approved. I mean, I don't know of any appeals that were like, oh, I cut our number in half. They tend to be pretty small changes around the edge. Yeah.
And who evaluates?
Are we going? We're going to 7:30, aren't we? Oh, great. We have lots of time.
Yeah, we're got 38 minutes, Josh.
I thought we were going to 7, and I was like, oh no, what will we do? We're going to 7:30. Great. I mean, if anyone needs to drop off, but we have time.
So much time. Josh, just continuing on the subject of appeals, what organization is evaluating the appeals? And is it one that is an actual part of the sequence, which originally set up the RHNA?
Yeah, that's an important point. The people who evaluate the appeals is ABAG, the people who develop the methodology. So they still have their statutory guidelines. They still have, the elected constituents that answer to the people. But last time, I think it was ABAG elected officials that did the appeals. So I mean, maybe that's the reality, is that doesn't help their chances if you have to appeal if that's the appeal avenue.
So there was a little bit of a clarifying question, which is some confusion about the statement that cities just have to plan or zone for housing versus the statement that certain income levels have to be accommodated. So it's kind of a technical point about how you plan and zone certain sites at certain minimum densities to accommodate affordable housing. Yeah.
So RHNA has an overall number, but that's broken down by income category too. And it's a bit of a dilemma. How do you, if we say that a city's job is to set the table, to remove constraints, to zone for housing, how do they do that for low income housing? I mean, so one thing on a policies and programs level, they could have programs to raise funding or offer incentives to get more affordable housing built. But on a strictly quantitative, like on a RHNA level, what it goes down to is what are the assumptions that affordable housing developers need to build their affordable housing projects. And it used to be every city had to do its own calculations about that. And now the state has come up with a safe harbor assumptions or default assumptions. And they just assume in San Mateo County, either if you build to 20 or 30 units per acre, then that's enough for nonprofit developers to build affordable housing, with the understanding that it might not all be affordable housing, but cities have done their role with zoning for it and planning for it. I say this is one of the frustrating things, that there's really, in the system we live in, there's no amount of resources that'll get us the amount of market housing we need for the workforce, for people of all income levels. So it's not actually a fair bar to tell cities you need to have a plan to meet every drop of that housing, because there's just not the resources to do it. So cities should be held to a high bar. I mean, they should have to try really hard to make sure they're accommodating, the workforce, people who live there, teachers, baristas, whoever it is, young children, big families. They should be held to a high bar, but the state just recognized that it's just not feasible for most cities. They don't have the resources to build all the affordable housing they need to build.
So it's kind of connected to what you were just saying. There was a question about how RHNA takes into account housing for typical employee demographics for the jobs that are growing. So for example, how does it factor in small units for young singles or for workers with families? How do those numbers come about?
So the state looks at the current income of residents, and that's what they use to assume what's needed. And then that's how that starts with the big number from the state. It's broken down by income level based on current population, and then cities get their income targets not actually based on the jobs, but based on those criteria we talked about earlier. This is how it determines whether or not a city gets more low income, very low income, or low income. And there's a certain logic to it, right? Lower income people, you really actually want them to be more likely they're more likely to need transit. So that's why the methodology committee recommended that they be near transit. And it actually is more important, the methodology committee thought, for low income people to be in high opportunity areas because they have more limited resources. So that's why, I should say, I didn't say this earlier, but there's no one right methodology. If you have a methodology that you think would make everyone happy and work for everyone and get no complaints within, volunteer for that methodology committee next cycle, and you'll be everyone's hero if you could, like, if you're like, here's how we should do it. Now everyone agrees. So this is what they came up with. There's a logic to it. It's not perfect. But anyway, no, so the specific low income numbers were based on these criteria.
Josh, there's a couple of more questions about sort of how does conserved land on the peninsula impact RHNA? And then also, once again, for fire danger in places like Portola Valley or Woodside, do they have lower numbers because of the wildfire risk?
So Plan Bay Area did not assume that the hills would be built on. They did not assume the parks would be built on. So those are just kind of same with Marin. There's a bunch of areas. I mean, the East Bay has their big parks district. So they're just kind of off the table. So the housing need is put into the developed areas. Beyond that, cities obviously have a lot of control about where they put their housing if they want to. I mean, that's where the state and the region doesn't give them requirements. They can put in near transit, they can put it near their downtown if they have a downtown. So that's, I mean, I think there's hopefully some common sense and some requirements not within a city not to expose those new units to unnecessary wildfire risk. So was there more about wildfire for some communities?
It was really about, there was a couple of questions about some communities that are particularly at risk of wildfire. So Portola Valley, for example. But
yeah,
I think you answered it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important for Portola Valley and their housing element and other cities that have wildfire risk to make sure they're doing everything they can to limit that risk, make sure that there's defensible spaces. I think we were just talking with, I forget if it was, I think it's Portola Valley, and they said the roads have capacity to evacuate people. If we need to evacuate people, they said that wasn't a constraint. I mean, honestly, it's the Bay Area. There's nowhere like liquefaction zones, fault lines, fires. I mean, if you start to sea level rise, if you start to, I joked when I first moved here, I was after helping in Katrina in New Orleans. I was like, I just wanted to go to a place that didn't have any natural disaster risk. That's why I chose the Bay Area. But obviously everywhere here is extremely constrained. And then when you add in layers like where there's toxic soils and where's are already built and not likely to be built out, I think, we gotta find housing where we can find housing.
You ready for more questions?
Yeah. And I'll just remind people, please put your questions in the question and answer. We're not really getting to them if they're on the chat. It's hard for us to monitor the chat.
So speaking of finding housing where you can find housing, there's a question about, so with the state, the question term is mandating that ADUs or JDUs or JADUs are allowed in single family zones, and then that could potentially add 1 or 2 units to every single family home lot, why doesn't that automatically massively increase the possibilities for RHNA?
Well, because RHNA, you have to run it by another screen, which is how likely it is to be built. So that's where the JADUs and ADUs, because we know, I mean, I think if we're just being honest, we know that there's not going to be, you know, 2 ADUs at every property in San Mateo County. We know that there's going to be a lot. There's an increasing trend. We know it'll probably increase. We know there's things cities can do to influence it. All that can be taken into the conversation. But I think it would just be an unrealistic assumption to assume that every property is going to build a JADU, add an ADU. So that's why the state methodology doesn't allow that.
A couple more questions about types of housing that can be allowed for the RHNA. So what about hotel conversions? Hotels or motels that have been converted to housing?
If they have a kitchen facility, or even like if they're expected to eat within their unit, then yes. If it's otherwise, that's going to get a little bit, there's going to be some negotiation with the state about what exactly is counted or not with that. I mean, I think right now a lot of those hotels are just temporary housing units, so those probably won't count. But if they get converted to permanent housing, there's going to be a little bit of squishy negotiation about whether or not those are single room occupancy units or congregate care, where the congregate would not count. The state in initial conversations was looking for ways to allow those units to count. So hopefully we'll be able to find ways.
All right, then I got a whole bunch of other building types in one question, which is, what about RVs, mobile homes, and prefab construction, or trailer-based tiny homes which can be moved and maybe because they're mobile, accommodate changes in environmental or sea level rise conditions?
Generally, all housing units by building code in California have to have permanent foundations. So an RV is generally not considered a building permit. And that's it's some like where you're in an earthquake zone. So that's why the building people insist on that rule. Most of those other things sound like they could count if they have, if they meet that census definition of a unit, if they have a kitchen and a bathroom. Mobile home parks count. I doubt there'll be a lot of new mobile home parks planned, but if there were, that would count. As long as it's settled down. Modular construction, prefab construction, state's neutral on that. It's all a housing unit in the state size.
Great. Josh, there's a question about whether a state plan development zoning would still be required to accommodate accessory dwelling units and junior accessory dwelling units in the way that single family home zones have to.
This is not exactly a RHNA question, but state law says that anywhere that allows residential, the cities have to permit ADUs or JADUs. And they also say that homeowners associations can't make unreasonable restrictions. So I don't remember the exact words, but they have to, homeowner associations can't outright ban ADUs.
Okay. It's kind of in the spirit of whether or not you could create additional housing sites in those. So are there requirements to build supportive housing for people with developmental disabilities or mental health disabilities who are extremely low income?
So cities have to look at those needs. There's no, this comes back to like it's kind of sometimes good that the state not to be too prescriptive. It's kind of this balancing act. But sometimes it's good to lay out the rules. So the state says you have to allow supportive housing. You just have to treat it like other housing. You have to look at those populations and talk about what their needs are, but it's not part of the RHNA process per se. But it's definitely part of the housing element process. And that's definitely one where you should talk with your local jurisdiction staff and tell them that population is important to you, and really encourage them to think about some good solutions. And we were just talking to South San Francisco, and they were working with developers to set aside some units, some affordable units for that population. So I think there's nice models out there.
Do you need a break from questions? Should I answer a few? You're doing okay?
Yeah, I think I'm doing okay. You
Okay,
can
all right.
too if people are getting tired.
What is the city's responsibility for meeting the below market rate requirements? And if they don't meet those numbers, what happens to the new requirements? Is the old number added to the, is the number added to the old number?
So city's responsibility is to zone for housing and remove constraints. And so they need a zone for at least 20 or 30 units per acre to meet that that low income or extremely low income. Extremely low income is not exactly arena category, but cities need to look at it. And there's if there's not enough resources to actually build those units, then the state doesn't punish you. If you commit to do something and you don't do it, you could be in trouble. And also there's a new rule that if you would assume something would be affordable housing and it comes out as market rate housing, you need to make sure that there's enough land otherwhere for the affordable housing to be built. So it's good to have a buffer for that reason. And if you don't have a buffer, then you might have to rezone to make sure more land's available for affordable housing. But this is one of those things where it should be in the policies and programs section where cities should figure out everything they can do to, if it's important to cities to have low and moderate income housing, they should identify all the policies, programs, whatever avenues they have to promote affordable housing. That's something that 21 Elements, if cities are interested in that, will work with cities to identify strategies.
Yeah. What about, the projections taking into account the number of people who are working from home? Does the RHNA methodology take into account changes in people's workplace behavior?
Plan Bay Area did assume that a lot of people who are able to work from home would work from home. A lot of jobs, obviously that's not possible, but for jobs where it is possible, they did assume that there would be a shift to working from home.
There's a lot of the remaining questions are about sort of policy and strategies, and also communications and community, how you talk about RHNA and how you talk to your elected officials about RHNA. Should we go there?
Let's do this Portola Valley's question first. The equity adjustment for Portola Valley was not that large. You can look at the memo, that one that I was saying was a real good resource. It'll tell you what it was, but the equity adjustment for Portola Valley was pretty modest. Yeah, before we go there, let's see if there's any other questions that are more directly related to RHNA.
Just for fun, if all single family homes zone parcels were rezoned to allow 2 homes, would that allow cities to claim all of those parcels for RHNA purposes?
So that would fall into that same category as ADUs. We would have to come up with some methodology that works for what's a likely uptake rate of those units. That's something actually that jurisdictions have asked us to do. So we're working with a modeling firm to come up with some reasonable assumptions. And then this is where 21 Elements is nice. So then we'll take what we think are reasonable assumptions. We do working with this modeling firm. And then we'll go to the state and we'll say, we want to make these assumptions. If a jurisdiction rezones all single family homes to allow duplexes, we think they should be able to count this many for their RHNA, and then we'll get the state to buy off on those assumptions. And then cities will know before they make their policy what exactly, what the rules are and what they can claim. So there's no clear methodology at this point. This whole single family home discussion is it's definitely much bigger now than 5 years ago or 8 years ago when we did the previous housing elements. But excuse me, we're working on what we think is a reasonable methodology about what the uptake would be.
Great. Josh, another question just about, taking into account the need for multiple sources of egress, and particularly in Portola Valley, the question about does the RHNA take into account 2 streets out for evacuation? I think you've already answered it, but just it's important, so I wanted to just go back to it.
Yeah, so Plan Bay Area looked at transportation and made sure everyone could safely evacuate. Additionally, cities, when they're adopting their housing elements, will continue to look at evacuation routes. It's a new requirement. They're required to look at their evacuation routes and figure out how to get everyone out safely in the event of a fire.
Great. So I think those are the main kind of RHNA methodology questions. There's a couple of other fun questions here. There's another one about the equity adjustment for Woodside, which the same answer is pertains. We just take a look at the ABAG report.
And it was the same thing. It was what I didn't like about it was the cities. It was there were some low income cities that got high equity adjustments. It didn't play out as you would think it would. So the Woodside, Portola Valley, neither of them had dramatic equity adjustments.
So this is a long question, and how about if I just go for it?
Go for it.
Okay, I understand you to say multiple times that RHNA requirements are satisfied by zoning for and removing constraints to meet the allotted number of units. Yet in Portola Valley, I frequently see attention paid by the Planning Commission and the Town Council to whether the number of permits that have been issued satisfy the RHNA mandates. Please clarify.
Oh, this is going to be a complicated one. Okay, one sec. I'm going to take off my sweater. That I'll answer.
You're taking the sweater off.
Yeah. That's what that question did to me. The next step will be opening the window here. So there's really there's two things going on. One is getting your housing element certified. And that's really, like I've said, evidently I said multiple times, it's really about zoning. But then there's your annual progress report of how well you're doing towards meeting your RHNA. And that actually is the one where the building permits come in. Now, if you're not making enough progress on your annual building permits, this is where I can go back a bunch of slides. The consequences are less dire. So I was saying, like, a judge can take over your land use authority, all these things. If you don't have enough, if you don't zone enough, all these really serious things can happen. If you don't have a certified housing element, all these serious things can happen. But if you're not making progress on your housing element because you're not issuing enough building permits, the consequence is that it's easier for developers to build. It's called SB 35. I'll get to it just as I actually finish answering that question. So these questions, yeah. So what happens if we do not meet our RHNA because developers do not build? So that's why after your housing element is certified, they're counting their building permits. And that's why they're doing it, to make sure this consequence from Senate Bill 35 doesn't kick in, where it's easier for developers to build.
All right. This is a good question about a recent law that affects how you use sites. Can cities assume that new laws like SB 899 will pass, allowing religious institutions to build affordable housing on their land?
So you can, let's see. So I think that law passed, right? The letting religious institutions make it easier for them to build on their parking lots. So yeah, if that everything is into play, right? So you have to make a fair argument that religious institution is likely to build land on their parking lot or renovate their structure. So I'm not sure the number SB 899. There was you can't take into account bills in the legislature, but last cycle there was one that made it easier for religious institutions to build in their parking lots. So yeah, you can definitely cite that. If you have a religious institution that says, "Hey, we're interested in building in our parking lot," then in your list of sites to meet your RHNA, you list that site from that building, from that church or that congregation, whatever it is. So those definitely can count. And it's kind of like a holistic, what's likely to build. It's a little holistic. So if you can cite state laws as making it more likely to build, that's great. If a congregation expresses an interest, developer expresses an interest, you can show that the market forces are all lined up, so it's more likely to build. Well, that makes it easier to avoid scrutiny about your site's inventory.
Josh, that particular bill didn't pass. That was one that was introduced by Scott Wiener. There's another bill that did pass that has just to do with replacement parking for religious institutions that has a similar number, confusingly, and I'll put that in the chat. But yeah, I don't think you can assume that any laws are going to pass, with that until they passed. But yeah.
Is there a deadline for jurisdictions to challenge the RHNA number? Well, there will be a deadline, but until they open until they actually announce when the period is, it can't close. But yeah, so it'll be a discrete period when cities can challenge it. I don't know if it'll be 60 days or what the time frame is, but it'll be a discrete period.
Yeah.
This summer.
What about, and you've already answered this a couple of times, but just, it's an important point. Is there any flexibility in evaluating the RHNA numbers as cities encounter unintended consequences? You've said that COVID is not considered an unintended consequence or unexpected. What was it? What was the term you used? I'm sorry.
Unforeseen events.
Unforeseen event, right? Sorry. Yeah. Is there any flexibility?
Cities have a lot of flexibility about where they put their housing, what type of housing they want. There's very little flexibility at this point in appealing RHNA numbers. It's just those handful of categories, excuse me, that are eligible to appeal on, and they're pretty they're pretty narrow. But if a city can make a case that it meets one of those criteria, I mean, understand the success rate is 5 or 10%. Understand that it takes staff a lot of time to put together that application. But if a city really feels that it has merit under one of those categories, they can appeal when the appeals period opens.
Is there a RHNA number for unincorporated San Mateo County?
There is. Can scroll on down a bunch.
Tell you what it is. We can even tell you what it is.
Yeah, well, we could tell you what it is. We'll pull it up in a minute. Yeah, so the unincorporated counties need to have RHNA numbers too. Why don't you go on? We'll just show that slide in a minute.
Great. So there's still a little bit of confusion about the building permit issue, and it's complicated. So I'm not clear on the building permits answer, which is correct. If units are zoned for, but developers don't build, no consequences for the city, but if enough building permits are not issued, are there consequences for a city? There's
two distinct things, and it's just easier to never try and combine them, because if you try and combine them, like the twains shall never meet, you'll get really confused. There's the question of getting a certified housing element, and that's what we've been talking about today. And that's really 90-some% just on the amount of land you have available, land zoned for housing. I mean, so the projects that are approved or that are not approved under construction. So all those things count too. So in that way, building permits count, but it's most of your RHNA is going to be met by the land that's zoned for housing. And that's how you're going to get a certified housing element and avoid all of the draconian, the really serious consequences of not having a certified housing element. And I should say the state approved money for the Attorney General to go after cities that don't have certified housing elements. The Department of Housing and Community Development has been monitoring, writing letters, referring things to the Attorney General. So there's just more and more awareness and consequences. That's getting a certified housing element. So we should just close that. Okay, we understand. That's how you get a certified housing element. You have enough sites, and there's these really big consequences. Now, there's another question of okay, it's 2025 and not a lot of housing is coming in. What happens then? You already have your certified housing element. Your certification's not going to be stripped. You're not going to face those serious consequences. But there was a bill called SB 35, which laid out a number of ways for it to be easier for a developer to build housing if you're not building enough housing. So if your jurisdiction's not approving enough housing, then those streamlined building rules apply. So that's why now every year cities do their annual progress report. They tally how many building permits they're issued, and they report that to the state, so that those rules, if they're building enough, those rules are making it easier for developers to build, don't apply. So that's the other half of it. So first half, getting a certified housing element, mostly just about sites. Draw the line, forget about that. Showing you're making enough progress on actually building housing, separate question, will happen years after you have your certified housing element, and that's more about building permits. It's hard. We didn't prepare a slide on it, so it's a little hard to explain it without without a slide. Follow up with an email if I'm still confusing you, and we can lay it out more clearly.
Okay, Josh, there's a variety of questions about sort of what happens around production of affordable housing. So one question says, statistics show that most places met their market rate housing and even exceeded it, but failed to meet affordable housing targets. Other than zoning for 20 units to the acre, which is the default density for most jurisdictions in San Mateo County, will failure to make progress on affordable housing lead to any penalty? And then there's, I think from from a different person, is there a penalty or incentive for cities to fulfill the very low income housing target?
So if cities aren't building enough low income housing, this is not about getting your housing element certified, but year to year, if you're not building enough housing for low income categories, then it's easier for developers to build higher, taller, fewer city rules. Subjective city rules don't apply. There's all these things that make it easier for developers. So that is the biggest consequence traditionally for not building enough affordable housing. Was there a second half, Paul?
That's it. I mean, I think, is there any other way for jurisdictions to show proactively that they're putting in policies or programs to advance affordable housing other than just showing that they're zoning them at 20 dwelling units to the acre?
I mean, there's a whole bunch of policies and programs to encourage affordable housing. Traditionally, they fall in either you have revenue you put into affordable housing. So you do something to raise money and then give it to nonprofit developers, and then they'll build affordable housing, or you require market rate developers to build a certain percentage of their units as affordable. Now, if you require them to build 75% of their units as affordable, cost of construction is just too high. None of them will build, but you can push that percentage up as high as you can and still have them build. And then you can get affordable units that way. So that's, I mean, I think those are the big bucket strategies of how you get more affordable housing. And honestly, they're at least as important as zoning. Like the zoning for 20 or 30 units per acre, you have to do it for state law. It is important because it is true that the nonprofit developers really can't build they can't build easily or at all if the zoning is too low. But those resources and those requirements, those policies and programs, that's how it gets built. And because those things are not quantitative, there's the most scrutiny. The state puts the most scrutiny on the RHNA and on the quantitative things because it's easiest. But my goodness, cities, it's so important to put an emphasis on those policies and programs. And if you care about making sure that there's affordable housing in your city or workforce housing, go to your meetings with your cities and say, we want really bold policies to do that, because that's what'll make a difference in that area.
Hey, Josh, this is a question that I think you'll want to answer because it's something we've heard a lot that people are concerned about. Are you saying that the only way to realistically get these arbitrary numbers is to terminate single family zoning, since with the tight development in the area, it's likely they cannot be reached without such action?
No, I am not saying that.
No one's saying that.
No one is saying that. It is a totally up to a city discussion if whether or not they want to rezone single family neighborhoods. There are plenty of strategies for, in fact, when Plan Bay Area was looking, they didn't assume that single family neighborhoods would be converted to wholesale converted to multiplexes. They focused their attention on malls, underperforming office parks, abandoned strip malls, or the big parking lots. That they focused their attention on that. So if a city thinks that there's good reason to look at things you can do in single family neighborhoods, then they should do that. And if they want to pursue other strategies, cities should pursue other strategies. There's no requirement and there's no need to do that. It's simply a city's decision about what they think. I mean, there's policy reasons to do that. There's policy reasons to not look at city family neighborhood. That's just a city decision.
There's a couple of questions about community outreach and whether jurisdictions have an affirmative obligation to do public meetings and outreach, which is not the subject of tonight's meeting. but I don't want to think we're ignoring you. The answer is yes, and that's what we're doing to Let's Talk Housing. So absolutely, cities do have an affirmative obligation to do outreach.
And I see a bunch of city staff on the call tonight listening in, taking in. We're going to do a summary and send all of your questions and comments to them. And also there's a lot. This is, as I said, this isn't the most interactive of meetings. All the other city meetings, town meetings will be much more interactive and lots more opportunity
With smaller groups.
So
there's a question about, she says, I assume that it's easier for developers to build low-income housing, not just housing in general, when not enough affordable housing is being built.
I would say right now today in California, if you wanted to, the cost of construction is so high that even if you got the land for free, you couldn't build affordable housing and rent it at very low income or maybe low income prices. You would need, just to pencil, just to break even if you didn't care about a profit, you would need subsidy. So you don't see market rate developers by and large doing that. Sometimes they do because they can tap into the subsidy too. But you see that in order to make it pencil, because cost of construction and cost of land is so high, that you see affordable housing projects being built with subsidies from local governments, or being required as a smaller percentage of a market rate development. If a market rate developer builds 100 units in some cities, you might be able to say, well, 15 of those have to be affordable, and the cost of construction is not so high that it's still feasible in those cities. I just chose 15% as a random example. It could be different in other cities.
There's 3 minutes left, Josh, and we've got 14 really smart questions.
Let's do a speed round, Paul.
Well, I'm gonna try to combine a couple of them. So
okay.
One really good question is, do the Mullen densities get adjusted based on the 2020 census? And there was a question earlier about whether or not the RHNA numbers would take into account changes once the final 2020 census numbers are released.
I believe the default, the question of whether or not it should be 20 or 30 units per acre will be affected by the most recent census, but I'll have to double check about what year is the target year. And no, RHNA numbers they're done except for appeals. I mean, except for adopting a final methodology and appeals. So the census numbers won't affect that.
Yeah, so we can follow up on the Mullen densities, otherwise known as the default densities, which is a link I put in the chat a little bit earlier. Josh, with 2 more minutes, do you want to take a couple more questions?
Well, I told people if someone at one of the public meetings, they were like, please stay long, like answer all my RHNA questions now. And I said, I'll stay late at the RHNA meeting to answer all your RHNA questions, but there's so many other things to talk about. I don't want to not be able to talk about policies, programs, goals, all these other things. So I'm happy to stay late to go through some of these other questions, but I want to actually wrap up the meeting formally. To share additional thoughts or let us know how we did, go to that link. Daisy, I'll put it in tinyurl.com/allaboutRHNA. We'd love your additional thoughts. We'll get them to cities. We'll answer your questions. Oh, next up, we're going to be producing a frequently asked questions section, FAQ, not an EAQ, not an every asked question. So if your question is super specific, it might not make the FAQ sheet. Also, if your question doesn't have a Q in it, then we'll happily pass that on to cities. Share your feelings. I'll read it. We'll make sure it gets shared, but we're not, and we'll include it in the meeting summary, but we're not going to include that in the FAQ. We'll email out the presentation and links. There's hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of reading about RHNA and Plan Bay area. So we'll share those for you, and more available. Oh, and we'll make those links available. Let's Talk Housing. Let's Talk Housing is, again, the vehicle we use to help all the cities get their word out. Again, Let's Talk Housing is not funded by developers, only jurisdiction money, only answers to jurisdictions, only goal is to make jurisdictions' lives easier to adopt the policies they want, get certified housing elements, no advocacy whatsoever. But visit us at Let's Talk Housing, stay informed there, sign up to get updates. So with that, we're going to end the formal part of the meeting, and we'll keep answering questions until, I think I offered 4 hours at the meeting. So hopefully we won't go that far, but we'll keep.
I'm going to eat dinner at 8 o'clock no matter what, Josh. So you're
okay. Well, my wife is struggling with both kids. So if we get home by 8, I can help put the kids in.
That would be
If
great.
kids, I think we'll get through these questions.
Yeah, so let's just knock them out. So this question's been waiting for a while. Has the state considered encouraging municipalities to increase their people per housing unit density? So rather than building more homes, tell people that they need to double up in existing housing units.
No, we have a wish list project. I told you our last arena bill didn't get out of committee. So we have a wish list project that would give people credit for home sharing and other things to make better if cities or towns make better use of their homes. It's a wish list project. It's not going to get in this cycle for sure. I don't know. I mean, the last one went so tanked so quickly. I don't know if we're going to put our limited staff energy into that. But I hear you. I feel like if you can get 2 families housed in a home, it would be great. It would be great to get credit for it, but there's no credit right now.
Is the state?
But I should say that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, right? Like there's a whole bunch of things that cities can do that are really good policies and programmings, like HIP Housing, a nonprofit, runs a great home sharing program. Partner with them. They'll help you, seniors, anyone, find someone to share your house. They'll vet the tenants. They'll help work out the lease. Cities are totally encouraged to do that, even if you don't get RHNA credit for it.
Yeah. Is the state keeping an eye out for cities doing quote unquote sketchy things in their RHNA?
Yeah, we won't. They singled out a particular city, but we won't mention what city they're.
I'm not going to mention the city.
Yeah. So are they? Yes. The state has new enforcement money to watch over housing elements. And oh my goodness, if you get on the state's list of like, they think you're a bad actor, they will watch your city council meetings to see if you're not following through, or you're not following through your commitments, or not doing good things for housing. Luckily, I think San Mateo County actually has a really good reputation among the state for being pro housing and trying to do its share. Hopefully that reputation will continue, but yes, the state will watch out closely. There's some things that they don't have power to do. There's some things they do, but they're definitely watching cities.
Michael asked, does a barista count the same as a software engineer in the calculation of jobs?
In the calculation of jobs yes. So in terms of jobs, the jobs are just the total number. In terms of when RHNA is assigning, they were assigning RHNA based on jobs, it was just jobs within a 30-minute drive or 45-minute transit.
There is some analysis of occupational wage data related to jobs, and that goes into setting the income levels as well, but jobs is jobs. Karen, I'm not sure I understand your question.
I know what she's saying. There's been a whole bunch of questions about what happens. So this difference of like getting a certified housing element where you need sites, or the consequence of not approving enough housing. And Karen is saying, Google Valco Mall, and you'll see the mess of what happens if you're not approving enough housing. There's not a good example. There's actually a whole bunch of better examples where nonprofit developers use those rules to actually get good projects in more quickly. Valco Mall is an example of a consequence for a city that wasn't meeting their number, and but it's not the laws at its shining best. There's more examples around of actually the law helping housing rather than that one.
Yeah. Christine asks, if a city built more RHNA 5 than mandated, can those extra units count towards RHNA 6?
Nope, it's a close. No, the short answer is no. What happened in RHNA 5 stays in RHNA 5, unless you said you were going to do something and you didn't. What happens in RHNA 6 stays in RHNA 6. It would be nice if you got credit, but on the split side, you don't get consequences either. It's a fresh accounting period.
Okay, so another question, and this is about the sea level rise and climate change and how cities' land is being affected by these issues. Is it correct that the regional agencies in the state have not identified areas subject to rising sea levels and established a plan and funding to protect cities' lands where much more housing can be accomplished?
No, that's not how I think of it. The regional agencies have very detailed maps of what areas are subject to sea level rise, with various assumptions about what sea level rise will happen. Plan Bay Area does have a plan to mitigate that and to address that. Is there funding to do that plan? Well, Plan Bay Area has potential funding sources, but no, there's not funding to, oh my goodness, is there funding to mitigate climate change? No, there's not. It's a massive issue in the entire country. So there's not funding to do everything that's needed to mitigate climate change. But okay.
Yeah, there's so much so we could have a whole webinar just about this topic of sort of the intersection of climate resilience and affordable housing planning and how important those two issues are as interrelated issues. Thank you for the question. It's a really good one. Michael and Gil had two questions, which I wasn't sure I understood either. Which is that $700 per unit, which I assume you mean they're the construction costs. How can you offer an affordable rental? And then Gil said, but we could. So I wasn't sure those were exactly RHNA questions.
Yeah, I'm not sure they're talking to each other. It's very expensive to build affordable units. Construction cost is high, land cost is high. It's a challenge of the Bay Area. I mean, I don't think that means we shouldn't try. It probably just means we should try extra hard, but it's a challenge.
Listen, so I was looking at a performance today, not in San Mateo County, but the real cost was more about $475,000 per unit in development and construction costs, which is still really, really high. But we have really smart entrepreneurial affordable housing developers in this region who have become exceedingly good at acquiring sites and building housing using a whole variety of funding sources. So, it's not easy, but we're lucky in that we have maybe the best developed affordable housing development sector in the country, precisely because there are so many challenges in this region. So I want people to be hopeful that there is a lot of expertise and that we can do this. And what developers need, what they say they need is the minimum amount of land zoned at the right densities to make their projects pencil. That was a lot. When a city has zoning that allows for 100 units per acre, but the percentage of BMR units is met, how can this be addressed? I'm not sure I understand that.
I'm not sure I understand that question.
Pam, if you're still on and you want us to try to give it another whack at answering your question, please type it again or let us know what your question is. Developers have told me that if an affordable unit does not lease within an allotted time, it can be leased at market rate. Is this true? And if vacated later, is it then leased at affordable, Jen?
Different cities have different rules. I mean, it's any well-run program, most programs in San Mateo County are well-run. I'd actually say the city of San Mateo is one of the best run for a mid-sized city in the country. I think it's a really great team there. But any well-run program will not let a developer just choose not to lease it and then get out of their affordable housing requirements. Sometimes what happens is if affordable housing units are priced close to market prices and in the market tanks, there's a problem where the affordable housing prices are above market. Cities have different ways of compensating for that. Hopefully any well-run program has a good rule that doesn't involve losing those units, but is also fair to the developer in not making them sit with an empty unit or something.
Yeah, that is not an easy process. I mean, all of these units, particularly ones that use federal, state, or local financing, and also those that are subject to an inclusionary housing ordinance, have very detailed covenants and restrictions attached to the deed of trust that make it very difficult for developers to not lease the units at affordable rates. How many folks signed on tonight, please? That's
Daisy,
not a RHNA question.
Did you see? I know we had
Yeah.
almost 200 RSVPs. What was
At our highest point, we had close to 110.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then
110.
Mike asked, do density and height limits like those in San Mateo make it more difficult for affordable housing to pencil? 21 Elements does not meddle in cities' business. We don't tell cities what to do. If cities want to increase density, if they want to come up with policies, we'll make it easier. But Mike, I learned long ago that it's just, in order for cities to trust us, in order to work with cities, in order to be in their court, we just have to be totally neutral and not try and force cities to do things they don't want to do. 21 Elements has always been super careful not to force cities to do policies. If cities want to do policies, we'll make it easier. So yeah, so that your question, I don't want to feel like I'm forcing San Mateo County. There's a lot of things that go into construction costs. At some point, higher buildings make construction costs higher. At some point, it goes lower. It's really case specific. So it's hard to come up with a answer.
The answer is kind of maybe, like you get to a certain level of density and height and you get into a different construction type and it makes it harder to pencil. So it's very context specific, like Josh said.
Yeah. And I hope San Mateo City finds good policies that work for them. I mean, that's what we always say.
Yeah. How do we convince the state to increase the Bay Area's RHNA to account for people who live outside the area in Sacramento in the Central Valley?
Yeah, it's a good point that it doesn't really, I mean, it's one of the things that the advocates are like, it should be higher because there's all these people commuting into the Bay Area. Legislative action, that's how you do it.
So question, you see the question, Josh, it's still not clear on all these state laws and statutes will lead to affordable housing as opposed to unaffordable housing. San Francisco has built lots of new units over the past 30 years. The prices keep going up. How do these laws address this issue?
So this isn't exactly a RHNA question either, but
we're here.
Yeah, we're here. So basically, there's a real housing supply problem, and I think you have to have more housing supply so the prices don't keep going up. But that alone won't address the affordable housing, but that will take pressure off the market. So instead of increasing 10 or 20% a year, maybe it'll increase a small amount. I think there's plenty of evidence that housing markets do follow the laws of supply and demand, and an increase in supply will push down prices. I mean, the other thing is developers will always build, almost always the ultra luxury will be the most profitable and luxury the next most profitable, not always, but really, really common. So once they satisfy those markets, they'll push the unit down to not quite so premium construction styles. But yeah, I mean, you just, and then you need to let the market do its thing to reduce the pressure. And then you need to do everything you can to get affordable units, all the requirements you can, all the subsidies you can, get every inch of subsidy that you can out of market rate developers to increase that percentage of affordable units. And slowly you'll bend the curve.
I think also in San Francisco, and you do see this in the census data is that there's been an extraordinary number of permanently affordable and even supportive housing units that have been built in San Francisco, affordable to very low and extremely low income households. And indeed, as a percentage, San Francisco has a pretty high percentage of very low and extremely low income households compared to the rest of the region. It also has an extremely high percentage of high income households compared to the rest of the region. So in those units that aren't controlled by covenants or deeds and on deeds of trust or other restrictions, there's a lot of pressure on kind of that middle tranche of housing, if you will. So there has been a lot of affordable housing built, not nearly enough still. So Gil asked a question about you wanting to shed some light on the 21 Elements, how 21 Elements is working to consider changes to single family home zoned areas. Is it just going to be a percentage?
So we're just at the start of this process. If people have thoughts they want to share about what analysis would be useful, by all means tell us. We want to look at the affordability of duplexes, triplexes, quads now. We want to look at the ownership patterns of those units. And then we'll work with a forecasting firm to look at how much they're likely to build. And we're hoping that they can get specific, not just, for every 1,000 homes, you can get this many, you should expect this many units, but something more sophisticated, like if you have this type of programming, these types of conditions, here's what's likely. But then at the same time, when we go to the state to get approval for our methodology, so cities kind of know what they're getting into before doing it, we have to make it a little simpler for the state to approve or not approve. Still at the early, we're totally open to your thoughts, anyone's thoughts about the way to tackle that. Again, that's only for cities that are interested in that policy, no pressure on cities that aren't.
So there's no San Mateo County subregion. What would a subregion have been used to do?
In previous cycles, cities have formed a subregion which allowed them to take the RHNA for the whole county or for the subregion and divvy it up among themselves. That worked in previous cycles because there were some jurisdictions that had extra capacity and they could volunteer to have higher RHNA because they had just rezoned and they had a lot of space. This cycle, there's no cities have extra capacity. So there was no one that would have volunteered for higher numbers. So it just didn't seem a good use. A lot of staff time has to go into that subregion. The decision makers ultimately it was elected officials decided it wasn't a good use of their time to pursue a subregion. 2 subregions were formed, 1 disbanded in the region, the cycle for the same region. I think Napa might be the only place still. There's only 1 place that's still moving forward with the subregion. Okay, last question. Sophie, you are the lucky one. Do you want to read it, Paul?
Yeah, sure. Is the state considering subsidizing rentals like they and the federal government do via tax policies, i.e. tax deductions for some part of the rental costs?
Everything's on the table. The state's super concerned about affordable housing. I mean, it's a huge issue for for people. It's a huge issue for elected officials. They're getting it from all sides. Whether or not that happens, I don't know. Who has a coin? I don't know if that's going to happen, but yes, I mean, everything right now, I mean, affordable housing can have a reduction on property taxes under certain circumstances. Whether or not another policy will end up sticking and passing the legislature, that is beyond my pay grade.
Yeah, and it was not, I wasn't clear whether by rental costs you meant, yeah, but tax deductions like property tax deductions, or whether you mean income tax deductions that equity investors in low-income housing tax credit projects can take against their future tax obligations.
And I think we are, this webinar is about RHNA.
Like
so I think a lot of people want to talk housing policy. There will be many nights where we can stay up late, maybe over beers someday when we can go back in person to talk housing policy. Is the state considering taxing the rich to pay for affordable housing vouchers? Honestly, they're considering everything. Will they do anything? That is to be determined. Before
I see one question from MJ Lee. I don't know if you all see it too.
No.
No.
So the question is, has the state considered encouraging municipalities to increase their people per housing unit density? For example,
yeah,
did we answer that?
Yeah, that was there earlier.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Let me get rid of it.
Okay. It was
okay. Well, folks, we got through all the question. My wife just texted, kids are bouncing off the walls. Where are you? It's 7:49. Thank you to everyone who stayed with us. Watch for follow-up emails with reading material, slides. You can watch this no doubt this webinar was so good that you want to watch it over and over again. We'll send a link to the recording. So when you can't sleep, you can watch it and it will help put you to sleep. And with that, have a good night. Thank you all for joining.